Bibliophiles of the internet, today I'm back to recommend some Sapphic books. As you may or may not know, there is a readathon that happens every September, appropriately known as Sapphic September, where the goal is to read Sapphic books. You can read any Sapphic books you want, but there's also a bingo board for each round, and I'm going to try to recommend you 2 or more books for each prompt. I made a whole other video recommending Sapphic books last September. I will link that down below in case you want even more ideas. And as I said in that video, my personal definition of Sapphic is very inclusive and expansive. I think it's really important to clearly say that a book is not defined as Sapphic solely based on whether there is a Sapphic romance or relationship at the forefront. Many of these titles may have Sapphic relationships in them, but I strongly believe that what defines a Sapphic book is the presence of Sapphic characters, regardless of their relationship status, gender, sexual orientation, experience of sexual or romantic attraction, or lack thereof. And I also want to make it really clear that the books I'm including on this list have been described as Sapphic either in the text itself, the book's marketing, or as stated by the authors themselves. I did a lot of research for this video, so shout out to the tremendous resources that are LGBTQ Reads, the Lesberry, Book Riot, Lambda Literary, and the Sapphic September Instagram account, just to name a few. I will link all of those amazing resources down below, but let's just get started. The first prompt is AAPI Author, and the first book I would suggest for that is Siren Queen by Ni Vo. This is historical fantasy meets the golden age of Hollywood. It's about a young Chinese-American actress who knows that the cost of fame comes at tremendous personal sacrifice. In this version of history, Hollywood is run by literal monsters who want to own everything about their talent, from their face and their names to their private lives. And it's an open secret that the film industry is run off a system of bargains made in blood and ancient magic. I haven't read this one myself yet, but it sounds really fantastic, and it kind of feels like if the Seventh Veil of Salome had magic and Sapphics. I would also recommend Immaculate Conception by Ling Ling Huang. This is a blend of weird fiction, horror, and speculative fiction about a young artist named Enka who got accepted to a very prestigious art school, but because she comes from very humble beginnings, she often doubts herself and unfavorably compares herself to her peers. Somehow she becomes close friends with Matilda, a very prolific artist that everyone hails as an emerging genius, and when Enka learns about a new form of technology that allows the user to literally inhabit someone else's mind, feel their feelings, think their thoughts, she knows that she's found the perfect way to keep Matilda close. This is such a bizarre, unhinged, unsettling, weird story about obsessive Sapphic friendship and also the complex relationship between individuality and art. Lastly, for this prompt, I highly recommend Hamajang Luck by Makana Yamamoto. This is pitched as Ocean's 8 meets Blade Runner in this action-packed sci-fi adventure about a non-binary character named Edie who's just been released from prison after serving an 8-year sentence. Edie blames their ex for betraying them and allowing them to take the fall for their last mission gone wrong, and then their ex reappears with a new proposition for one last job to rob the billionaire who owns their space station, and if they can somehow pull it off, they could be set for life. Like I said, the main character is non-binary and also Native Hawaiian. The author has described this book as their oops all lesbian space heist, so it definitely fits for this prompt and would also work for the Sci-Fi Book prompt. Moving along to one of my favorite prompts, Sapphic Knights. Naturally, the first book that came to mind was Brighter Than Scale, Swifter Than Flame by Neon Yang. This is an Asian-inspired fantasy that's basically like if The Mandalorian was a Sapphic Knight who slays dragons. The main character, Yeva, has had a talent for slaying dragons ever since she was very young, and she has spent her entire life training to become a legendary guild knight. She is wholly devoted to her righteous cause, and one day she's ordered to travel to a reclusive kingdom where it's said that dragons are not feared but rather worshipped, and her mission is to find out whether this kingdom is secretly harboring a deadly dragon behind its borders. I had such a great time reading this one earlier this year. It's a quick read, it's captivating, it has some really interesting ruminations on morality, and this could also work for the AAPI Author prompt as well as 2025 release. Another novella that came to mind were the 2 novellas in the Fireborn Blade series by Charlotte Bond. This is about Madeleine, a female knight who finds herself disgraced after a dramatic incident, and she feels the only way she can restore her honor is to retrieve the fabled Fireborn Blade from the fearsome dragon who watches over it. The first novella is like a classic fantasy adventure story that flips the dragon slayer dynamic on its head, and the second novella has more Orpheus vibes when the main Sapphic pairing has to descend into hell for the next part of their journey. They're both both really great and pretty underrated. Another book I haven't read but I've heard really good things about is Where the Shadows Bloom by Catherine Bakewell. This is a queer YA romantic fantasy said to be perfect for fans of Alison Saft and Margaret Rogerson. It's about a character named Ophelia who lives in this fantasy world overrun by shadow monsters. All her life she's been protected by Lope, a knight who defends Ophelia from the shadows and also dreams of escaping this shadow world with Ophelia by her side. I honestly don't know much more than that, but I am a sucker for a good bodyguard romance. I love the devoted knight or devoted defender trope, so this sounds like a good romantic time. The next prompt is Ace or Aro Sapphics, and I'm going to start by recommending Dear Windy by Anne Zhao. This is an upper YA story following two college freshmen. The first is Sophie, a young Aro Ace girl who's more strict and buttoned up, and she runs this anonymous Instagram account where she offers earnest relationship advice. She actually has an online rival named Joe who runs another anonymous Instagram account also offering relationship advice, but in a way that's much less prescriptive and much less serious. And of course, they don't know the other person is their online rival when the two of them get paired up in class to work on a group project. To be honest, I do have my issues with this story, but I still think it's incredibly valuable and still very much worth reading. It is a beautiful thing to see two Aro Ace characters, one who already knows their identity, the other who's growing into it, queering the concept of intimacy and closeness. And it's lovely to see a queer platonic friendship that gets the same kind of shine we normally only see in a romance. This next book is a bit darker and one that I've heard of but haven't read myself, and that is Arden Grey by Ray Stovey. This is a YA contemporary story about a young Ace teenager named Arden whose mother left their family, her father and brother refuse to talk about it, and she's also being harassed by a classmate about her sexuality, which isn't even public knowledge. When her only close friend begins dating someone new, Arden begins feeling very disconnected from him, and when she realizes that her friend's relationship might be devolving into something toxic, it makes her reconsider whether her own relationship with her mom also had that unhealthy dynamic. This definitely seems like it's dealing with heavier topics, so keep that in mind and approach with caution, but it does center a young sapphic asexual character, so it does fit for this prompt. Then we have indie or small press author, and I'm going to start with a book that I talk about constantly despite not having read it yet myself, and that is Metal from Heaven by August Clark. This is a political sci-fantasy story said to be perfect for fans of The Princess Bride and Gideon the Ninth. It's about a fantasy world where a new metal known as Icarite has become the most valuable resource. The mining of Icarite is dependent on the labor of underprivileged and unpaid workers who also suffer illness and ailments after coming into contact with Icarite. One of these workers is actually a child worker named Marnie who is protesting work conditions with her family and friends when the mining company opens fire on the protesters and Marnie is the only one who survives. A decade later, the owner of the mining company is looking to arrange a political marriage for his ward, and Marnie sees this as a chance for revenge, masquerading as an aristocrat to win the hand of his ward and then finally kill the man who slaughtered her family and friends. Every time I talk about this book, I'm like, this is exactly what I want to be reading right now. So we'll see if I can actually make that happen. The other book I would suggest for this prompt is Fibre Tropical by Julian Delgado Lopera. This is a queer Latina story that begins in Colombia, where the main character, Francisca, is taken from her home and relocated to Miami, where she begins to feel more and more isolated as her mom is swept up in this cult-like evangelical church. But in being forced to attend all these different church events, Francisca also meets a girl named Carmen, who is the pastor's daughter and head of the youth group. And to get herself closer to Carmen, Francisca claims that she wants to be saved by Jesus. This would be great if you want to get ahead on some reading for Latina Heritage Month, which starts in mid-September. And this just sounds like an absolutely wild Latina story that deals with both religious trauma and discovering queerness. Next up is manga, comic, or graphic novel. The first book I recommend is A Guest in the House by M. Carroll, who actually has a few sapphic horror comics. This one is an adult graphic novel and creepy ghost story about a young woman named Abby who's recently married a widowed dentist, and as they begin their lives together, she begins learning more about her husband's first wife and realizing that this woman may not have actually died of natural causes. M. Carroll has such a distinctive style in their comics. The way they make use of the contrast between saturated colors and black space is really dynamic, and I love what this comic has to say about the parallel of being haunted versus the ways that we often haunt ourselves. I know it's pretty popular, but on the manga side of things, I do recommend checking out the so-called Green Yuri manga, also known as The Guy She Was Interested In Wasn't a Guy at All by Arai Sumiko. This is a slice-of-life music manga about a high schooler who always stops by this music store after school, and she has a huge crush on the cashier who works there, there and who seems to have a very similar taste in music. He's very alluring and mysterious, always wearing dark baggy clothes and a face mask, but little does she know that this supposedly male employee is actually one of her female classmates. This is one of those silly premises that could only ever exist in the wild and wacky world of manga. I've read a few chapters of this manga, and I think it seems really fun and earnest and heartfelt. The next prompt is Transfemme main character, and the first book I'm going to recommend is One of the Boys by Victoria Zeller. This could also work for 2025 release. It's a queer YA coming-of-age story about a teenager who was a very successful high school football star, but she lost all of her momentum and opportunities when she came out as trans. Now she's trying to find her place at school again as she navigates early transition, but it turns out her skills as a kicker are invaluable to the football team, who beg her to come out of retirement and play on the team again. I haven't had a chance to read this one yet, but I've heard really tremendous things. We definitely need more transfemme stories in the YA space, period, but also in stories that address what it's like to be a trans athlete, especially for trans girls and trans women in this political environment. So I think it's definitely worth a read. My other suggestion doesn't come out until later in September, but will be available to read in September nonetheless, and that is Best Woman by Rose Damu. This is a contemporary adult fiction story about a messy trans character named Julia who's agreed to be the best woman at her brother's upcoming wedding. And along with being nervous to navigate her transness with family and friends that she hasn't seen for a while, she also almost loses it when she learns that the maid of honor is none other than Kim, her unrequited high school crush. I love a story about messy trans characters who are making absolutely abysmal decisions and making their lives harder for themselves, and it sounds like that's exactly what this is. Next, we have the much talked about prompt of 2025 release, and the first book I would recommend for this is The Incandescent by Emily Tesh. This is a slice of life magical academia story about Dr. Walden, the director of magic at a boarding school that caters to students who are powerful magicians. Besides teaching A-level invocation, one of her duties is also securing the school's boundaries and protecting the kids from demonic incursions. However, even though it's her job to keep the school safe, little does anyone know that she actually carries a demon herself. I read this fairly recently. I thought it was a really refreshing take on the idea of magical academia. Even though it does deal with demons and dark magic, it's closer to light academia than dark academia. It has somewhat of an overarching plot, but it's mostly just following these academics as the school year progresses. And there's also a bit of an underlying sapphic romance. I would also happily recommend Coffee Shop in an Alternate Universe by C.B. Lee. This is a cozy adjacent YA sapphic contemporary fantasy about a chronic overachiever named Brenda who is desperate to submit an application for a scholarship, and suddenly a massive Wi-Fi outage happens right when the submission deadline is about to pass. She is desperate to connect to the internet anywhere she can, and she stumbles into this cafe that she's never seen before, and that's where she meets this cute, charming, charismatic barista named Kat. What neither of them realize is that they're from two different universes that are not meant to overlap, so even though they exchange numbers and agree to go out on a date, they won't be able to find each other again unless they find other portals connecting their universes. I thought this was a really fun and unique fantasy romance. I love the idea of there being two different versions of Los Angeles, one with magic, one without, and I think the story plays with the connection between those universes in really clever and interesting ways. Up next is translated work, and a translated sapphic work I've been intrigued by for quite some time is Dogs of Summer by Andrea Abreu, translated by Julia Sanchez. This is another story about messy, obsessive sapphic friendship. It's set in the Canary Islands in the southern region of Spain and follows two young girls who want nothing more than to escape the oppressive summer heat and leave their small town behind. The main character is fully infatuated with her best friend Isora, who seems to be more mature and more beguiling than she is. The narrator feels like people are more drawn to Isora than her, and that creates this desperation where she would be willing to do anything, no matter how strange, to keep her claim on her best friend and keep her close. Not to sound like a broken record, but I have also heard really great things about this, and I think it would also work for the Toxic Yuri prompt. My next suggestion is more of a backlist title, but I've consistently heard really good things about it. That is Notes of a Crocodile by Kui Myung-shin, translated by Bonnie Hui. This is a queer coming-of-age story set in Taipei during the late 1980s. It follows a nameless lesbian narrator nicknamed Lazi, who is afflicted by her attraction to an unattainable older woman, and she turns to a support circle of strange, eclectic university friends for guidance. I honestly don't know much more about the story beyond that, but I do know that this book is commonly hailed as a queer classic. Next up is Disabled Sapphics, and the first book I would suggest is Late Bloomer by Maisie Eddings. I believe this is an adult romance. It's about a character named Opal who recently won the lottery, which has allowed her to quit her dead-end job. But now she's being bombarded by people coming out of the woodwork to get a piece of her winnings. So she decides to move far away. She buys a flower farm in North Carolina, and she's prepared to live out the rest of her life just caring for plants. But there's a woman named Pepper waiting for her at the new farm who says that she's actually the rightful owner of the farm, and she refuses to vacate the premises. According to what I've seen, Opal is very strongly coded as undiagnosed ADHD, and Pepper is autistic. The other book I would recommend is a recent favorite of mine, and that is The No Girlfriend Rule by Kristen Randall. This is a YA contemporary story about a teenager named Hollis who really wants to get into the world of tabletop role-playing games, especially the world of SNS, which is the fictional version of D&D. But her boyfriend and his friends have a very strict rule that significant others cannot join an ongoing campaign. So she has to look for a whole new group of people to play with, which is how she stumbles upon this all-girls SNS campaign. And by taking a chance on them, she learns more about herself, her identity, and maybe even makes some new friends. In terms of disability rep, Hollis has anxiety and takes anxiety meds on page, and I just really appreciate this fun and heartfelt story about coming into your own and making space for good things in your life. Next is a really fun prompt called Toxic Yuri. For those who don't know, Yuri is a content tag used in Japan for manga, comics, and fiction that relates to queer women. So my first thought was The Safekeep by Yale Vandervouden. This is an incredibly tense, unsettling story set in the Dutch countryside during the summer of 1961. The main character, Isabel, is living alone in the family home since her brothers had both moved out and started their own lives. She's very strict and disciplined about how she runs the house so that she can preserve what her family built, but her routine is disrupted when her older brother announces that he has to leave the country for work and he's dropping off his new girlfriend, Ava, at the family home to stay as a long-term guest. I read this whole book in a day because I could not put it down. The way it violently oscillates between animosity to obsession to forbidden desire is absolutely intoxicating, and the way it blurs the lines between reality and perception makes it really hard to look away. I would also highly recommend A Sharp Endless Need by Marissa Crane. To be transparent, the main character is sort of gender questioning and doesn't explicitly use any identity labels for herself, but I think this still fits the bill. This is an adult coming-of-age story told in retrospect about a young basketball star named Mac, whose life completely changes right before her senior year when her father suddenly passes away and a new transfer student named Liv transfers to her school's basketball team. Mac and Liv quickly realize that they have this intense, game-winning energy and chemistry that translates into something really powerful both on and off the court. Again, this is very much a story about discovering heady, sapphic desire. It's another story about all-consuming friendship and how confusing it can be to both want to be someone and also want to be with them, especially when you're not allowed to express or name that kind of queerness. Whether or not you care about sports, this book will fuck you up, and I cannot recommend it enough. The next three prompts I can't actually recommend books for because they're just too subjective. Those prompts are Choose Your Own Prompt, Book from Your Physical TBR, and New or New to You Author. So you're on your own for those. Moving right along to the poetry or nonfiction prompt. I have some recommendations for books in verse that you can read, starting with Couplets by Maggie Milner. I don't get to talk about this book nearly as much as I would like. It's literary fiction written in verse about a woman who lives an ordinary life in Brooklyn with her boyfriend, but she secretly dreams of being seduced by women. And then one night she meets another woman at a bar and she falls into an all-consuming affair that changes her entire outlook on life. As you might be able to guess, this book is in fact written entirely in couplets, and it's so well executed too, especially considering how restrictive that form can be. It's a very unique story that I think so many more people should read. A close friend of mine actually recommended a sapphic middle grade novel in verse called The Deepest Breath by Meg Grahan. This is about an 11-year-old named Stevie who loves sea creatures and reading books. She has a best friend named Andrew, and people are constantly teasing them about how they're going to grow up and fall in love and get married, but Stevie knows that she doesn't like Andrew in that way. She actually likes another girl in her class. But she doesn't know whether it's possible or okay for girls to like other girls, so she asks a librarian to help her find books with stories about girls loving girls, and that helps her to find the courage to share that part of herself with her mom, her friends, and even herself. This sounds really sweet. I love a middle grade novel in verse, and this one seems incredibly timely as well, especially with how it spotlights the importance of access to literature, especially for young kids. And also, if you like this, I believe the author has other Sapphic novels in verse. Speaking of middle grade novels in verse, I also recommend It's All or Nothing Vale by Andrea Beatriz Arango. This is a middle grade Latina story about a young fencer named Vale who unfortunately got injured in a car accident and hasn't been able to train or compete for a few months. She still experiences chronic pain and is getting used to the different ways her body works now, but when she finally does get the green light to return to fencing, she finds that there's a new girl at her fencing gym who seems to have taken Vale's top spot. This is a perfect example of a book that has Sapphic characters and Sapphic undertones, but is focused on storylines outside of and beyond that dynamic. It's a really great story about making space for ourselves to change and to discover parts of ourselves beyond the boxes that we put ourselves in. This would also work for 2025 release, and since Vale experiences chronic pain and uses a mobility device, this could also count for disabled Sapphics. I know I didn't touch on the nonfiction part of that prompt, but I would love to hear your suggestions for Sapphic nonfiction if you have any. Penultimately, we have the prompt Sci-Fi Book. I've already mentioned a couple, but I would also recommend Volatile Memory by Seth Haddon, another 2025 release. This is the first novella in a sci-fi duology that is about a trans woman, so this could also work for the Transfemme MC prompt, named Willa, who is basically a bounty hunter of sorts. In this intergalactic universe, people wear high-tech masks that are designed to look like animals, and the abilities of those animals become a kind of power that the mask wearer can use. Willa receives intel about a very rare piece of tech waiting on a nearby planet, and if she can beat the other hunters to it, the payout could very well change her life. But this rare mask turns out to be sentient, or at least have some kind of consciousness wired into it, and now Willa has to partner up with this disembodied consciousness in order to outrun the other hunters. This is a really great series opener in my opinion. The relationship between Willa and Sable, the consciousness trapped in the mask, is deeply fascinating and really queers the concept of intimacy and romance in interesting ways. The story has kind of a sci-fi thriller edge to it, and I also appreciate that it's also a very vicious story about female rage and revenge. You know, I can never pass up the opportunity to recommend Time's Agent by Brenda Peinado, so here comes my well-trodden pitch once again. This is another sci-fi novella set in the distant future where access to pocket universes has become commonplace, and pocket universes are now heavily commodified. The main character, Raquel, was an archaeologist, and her wife, Marlena, was a biologist, and they were both at the forefront of unlocking how they could use pocket universes in their research in their respective fields. But something in their research went horribly wrong along the way because many years have now passed and Raquel is now a disgraced agent and her wife lives in a pocket universe that Raquel wears in a necklace. As I always say, the world of this novella is both deeply fascinating and deeply complex. The way the story uses pocket universes and alternate universes makes the story feel very ambitious, especially in such a short space, but I think it really works and I have not stopped thinking about this book ever since I read it. The last prompt on the 2025 Sapphic September bingo board is main character who is 40 plus years of age. Very shamefully, I don't actually know of any Sapphic books that fit that bill, at least off the top of my head. Maybe The Incandescent, because if I recall correctly, the main character is closer to middle age, but I'm not 100% sure. This is obviously an area of growth for me, so I would love to hear your suggestions if you have them. So those are my Sapphic September recommendations. Obviously, I could have mentioned so many more books besides just these, but I feel like whether you're taking part in the readathon or just looking for more Sapphic books to add to your TBR, this is a pretty solid starting point. If you have any recommendations that you would like to add for other folks, feel free to drop those down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.